Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and each day I invite you to join me as we reflect on a significant moment from our shared past. Today is November 29th, and we're looking back 78 years to November 29th, 1947. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, delegates voted on Resolution 181, a plan to partition Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international control. The vote was 33 in favor, 13 against, with 10 abstentions. The required two-thirds majority had been achieved. In Tel Aviv, Jews danced in the streets, celebrating what they saw as international recognition of their right to a homeland after centuries of persecution, culminating in the Holocaust. In Arab capitals and Palestinian towns, the vote was met with anger and grief, seen as the international community endorsing the dismemberment of Arab land and the displacement of its people. 6 months later, Israel would declare independence. The next day, 5 Arab armies would invade. The war that followed would create over 700,000 Palestinian refugees and establish Israel's borders far beyond what the UN had proposed. The partition plan itself would never be implemented, but the conflict it tried to resolve and arguably helped intensify continues nearly 8 decades later. The story of Resolution 181 is about the limits of international intervention in deep ethnic and religious conflicts, about competing historical narratives that cannot be easily reconciled, and about how attempts to solve one crisis can create new ones that last for generations. By 1947, Britain desperately wanted out of Palestine, and it's not hard to understand why. Britain had governed Palestine under a League of Nations mandate since 1920, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. The mandate was supposed to be temporary, preparing the territory for eventual independence. But Britain had made contradictory promises. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 had promised British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Simultaneously, Britain had encouraged Arab nationalism and implied support for Arab independence in the region. These contradictory commitments created an impossible situation. As Jewish immigration to Palestine increased in the 1920s and 1930s, accelerating after Hitler's rise and the Holocaust, tensions between Jewish and Arab communities escalated. Arabs feared becoming a minority in their own land. Jews, especially after the Holocaust, saw Palestine as their only refuge, a place where they could finally be safe and self-governing. By the 1940s, Palestine was consumed by violence. Jewish paramilitary groups attacked British forces and Arab communities. Arab groups attacked Jewish settlements and British targets. British soldiers were caught in the middle, trying to maintain order while satisfying neither side. The mandate had become unworkable. In February 1947, Britain announced it was referring the Palestine question to the United Nations. Britain would withdraw, leaving it to the international community to decide Palestine's future. It was an admission of failure. Britain couldn't resolve the conflict and wasn't willing to continue bearing its costs. The newly formed United Nations created UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, to investigate and recommend a solution. UNSCOP spent the summer of 1947 in Palestine. hearing testimony from all sides, visiting cities and settlements, trying to understand the competing claims. The committee heard from Jewish leaders who argued that Jews need a state after the Holocaust, that they had historical connections to the land, that they had legally purchased much of their property, and that they had built thriving communities. The committee heard from Arab leaders who argued that Palestine was Arab land, that its majority population was Arab, and that Jewish immigration was colonization being imposed against the will of the indigenous population. The committee also witnessed the humanitarian crisis of Holocaust survivors. Ships carrying Jewish refugees from Europe arrived at Palestine's shores, only to be turned away by British forces enforcing immigration quotas. The Exodus incident, where 4,500 Holocaust survivors were forcibly returned to Germany, particularly affected committee members. The Jewish need for a haven seemed urgent and undeniable. UNSCOP's majority report recommended partition, divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with economic union between them and Jerusalem under international administration. A minority report suggested a federal state with substantial autonomy for both communities. The majority report became the basis for Resolution 181. The partition plan was complex. The proposed Jewish state would comprise 56% of Palestine's land, though Jews owned only about 7% of the land and constituted about one-third of the population. The boundaries were convoluted, creating two parts of each state connected by narrow corridors. Jerusalem and Bethlehem would be an international zone. The plan tried to balance several factors, giving Jews enough territory for substantial immigration, keeping major Jewish settlements within the Jewish state, providing the Arab state with the best agricultural land, and minimizing the number of Arabs who would become minorities in the Jewish state. But it was geometrically awkward and satisfied nobody completely. The vote on Resolution 181 was preceded by intense diplomatic maneuvering. The Jewish Agency, representing Palestine's Jewish community, accepted the partition plan despite reservations. Many Jewish leaders wanted more territory and objected to Jerusalem's internationalization, but they recognized that the UN plan offered the international legitimacy they needed. David Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first prime minister, understood that a small state now could be expanded later, and that international recognition was crucial. Arab leaders rejected partition categorically. They argued that the UN had no right to divide a country against the will of its majority population. They pointed out that Arabs constituted roughly two-thirds of Palestine's population and owned most of the land. Why should they surrender half of it? The Holocaust was a European crime. Why should Arabs pay for European sins? The United States and Soviet Union both supported partition, though for different reasons. The U.S. was influenced by Holocaust sympathy, domestic political pressure from American Jews, and strategic calculations about Middle East influence. The Soviet Union saw an opportunity to diminish British influence and believed a socialist Jewish state might be aligned with Soviet interests. Britain abstained, essentially washing its hands of the situation. Many British officials predicted that partition would lead to war and thought the plan unworkable. The vote required intense lobbying. Both sides sought support from smaller nations. There were allegations of pressure and deal-making. When the vote came on November 29, 1947, it passed with exactly the two-thirds majority required, 33 to 13, with 10 abstentions. The partition vote immediately triggered violence that would escalate into full-scale war. Palestinian Arabs began attacking Jewish settlements and communities the day after the vote. Jewish paramilitaries retaliated against Arab villages. The violence grew more organized and intense as both sides prepared for the British withdrawal scheduled for May 1948. This period, between the UN vote in November 1947 and Israel's declaration of independence in May 1948, saw what historians call the Civil War phase of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Arab and Jewish forces fought for control of territory, particularly strategic roads and mixed cities. Atrocities occurred on both sides. Massacres of civilians hardened attitudes and made compromise increasingly impossible. As violence escalated, Palestinian Arabs began fleeing their homes, some forced out by Jewish forces, some leaving to temporarily expecting to return after Arab armies defeated the Jews, some fleeing the violence regardless of who is responsible. By May 1948, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had become refugees. On May 14, 1948, the day British forces completed their withdrawal, David Ben-Gurion declared Israel's independence. The new state controlled more territory than the UN partition plan had allocated, having captured areas during the Civil War phase. The next day, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded, beginning the interstate war phase. Arab leaders declared they would prevent partition's implementation and restore Palestine to Arab control. They expected quick victory. Instead, Israel not only survived but expanded its territory further, ending the war controlling 78% of mandatory Palestine, far more than the UN partition had proposed. The 1948 war created facts on the ground that persist today. Over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs became refugees, about half of Palestine's Arab population. Some fled the fighting. Some were expelled by Israeli forces. Some left expecting to return quickly. They did not return. Israel refused to allow their return, arguing that it would threaten the Jewish character of the state and that the refugees were a security risk. The Palestinian refugees settled in camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, where many remain today, along with their descendants. The Palestinian refugee issue remains one of the core obstacles to peace. The war also displaced Jews. Ancient Jewish communities in Arab countries faced persecution and exodus. Over the following decades, nearly 900,000 Jews from Arab countries emigrated, most to Israel. This created a roughly equal exchange in numerical terms, though the circumstances, experiences, and outcomes were very different. The war established Israel's borders, the Green Line, that would last until the 1967 war. Jordan occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt occupied Gaza. The Palestinian Arab state envisioned in the partition plan never came into existence. The armistice agreements that ended the war in 1949 left the region divided and hostile. There was no peace treaty, just a cessation of fighting. Both sides claimed betrayal and injustice. The conflict was frozen, not resolved. Understanding the partition's legacy requires acknowledging that both peoples have narratives that, from their perspective, are true and legitimate. The Israeli narrative emphasizes Jews had historical and religious connections to the land. They had legally purchased property and built communities. After the Holocaust, they needed a homeland where they could be safe. They accepted the UN partition plan despite its limitations. Arab rejection and invasion forced them to fight for survival. They won against overwhelming odds and built a successful democracy. The Palestinian narrative emphasizes that Palestine was an Arab land with a substantial Arab majority. Jewish immigration was a form of colonization supported by Western powers. The UN had no right to partition their homeland. The Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, saw Palestinians expelled from their homes and villages destroyed. They became refugees in their own land or in neighboring countries. Their dispossession and suffering continues. Both narratives contain truth. Jews did face persecution culminating in genocide and needed refuge. Palestinians did lose their homes and become refugees through displacement that was often violent and forced. Jews did have ancient connections to the land, and Jews did legally purchase much property. Palestinians were the majority population for centuries, and the partition did divide their homeland against their will. The problem isn't that one narrative is true and the other false. The problem is that both are substantially true, but they are irreconcilable. There is no interpretation of events that both peoples can agree on. This makes resolution extraordinarily difficult. Resolution 181 was never implemented. The Arab state it envisioned never came into being. The International Administration of Jerusalem never happened. The economic union between Jewish and Arab states never formed. The borders it proposed were immediately overtaken by war. So why does the partition plan still matter? First, it represents the international community's first major attempt to resolve the conflict, and its failure established patterns that persist. The UN proposed a solution without the consent of one party, the Palestinians, leading that party to reject it entirely. Force, not diplomacy, determined outcomes. The international community proved unable to enforce its own resolution. Second, the partition established certain principles that remain influential. The idea of two states, one Jewish and one Arab, sharing the land, the special status of Jerusalem, the notion that both peoples have legitimate claims requiring accommodation. Modern peace proposals often echo partition's framework, even if the details differ dramatically. Third, some Palestinians and their supporters still reference the partition plan, noting that even that compromise wasn't honored. Israel now controls far more territory than the UN allocated. They ask, if Israel rejected the UN's borders when it was convenient, why should Palestinians accept them? Fourth, the partition's failure demonstrates that imposed solutions to ethnic conflicts rarely work. Lasting peace requires buy-in from all parties. External powers can facilitate, but they cannot impose peace on unwilling populations. The partition plan failed partly because one side rejected it and the other saw it as a starting point rather than a final arrangement. Nearly 8 decades after the partition vote, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains unresolved. The core issues are the same: borders, Jerusalem, refugees, security, mutual recognition. Decades of negotiations have produced moments of hope. Camp David, Oslo, various peace proposals, but no final resolution. Each side has reasons to believe the other is not a reliable partner for peace. Each side has factions that reject compromise entirely. The partition plan's legacy is visible in modern peace proposals. The two-state solution, separate Israeli and Palestinian states, echoes the partition's framework. Debates about borders often reference the 1947 plan, the 1949 armistice lines, the Green Line, or the 1967 lines. Jerusalem's status remains contested, just as it was in 1947. But the situation has changed enormously. Israeli settlements in the West Bank, the growth of Israeli and Palestinian populations, the evolution of both societies, regional dynamics, the role of militant groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, the involvement of Iran and other powers, all make today's conflict far more complex than in 1947. Some question whether two states are still possible given the facts on the ground. Others insist it's the only viable solution. Some propose alternatives, a one-state solution, a confederation, or regional arrangements, but none has achieved sufficient support from both peoples. The partition of Palestine offers lessons about international conflict resolution that remain relevant. First, external powers cannot impose peace on deeply divided societies. The UN could vote for partition, but it couldn't make either side accept it. Lasting peace requires buy-in from the people who must live with it, not just from international diplomats. Second, historical grievances don't disappear with time. They often intensify. Palestinians who fled in 1948 passed their sense of injustice to children and grandchildren. Israeli Jews who survived the Holocaust or fled Arab countries passed their trauma down as well. Time doesn't heal these wounds automatically. Sometimes it deepens them. Third, competing narratives can both be authentic yet irreconcilable. Acknowledging the truth in the other side's story doesn't require abandoning your own, but it does require recognizing complexity and rejecting simplistic explanations of who is the victim and who is the villain. Fourth, refugee crises create lasting problems. The Palestinian refugees of 1948 remain a core issue 75-plus years later. Temporary solutions become permanent. Refugee camps become cities. The temporary becomes intractable. Fifth, violence often determines outcomes more than legal or moral arguments. The 1948 war, not the partition plan, determined Israel's borders. Force created facts that diplomacy then had to address. This is a tragic lesson, but an important one. Finally, international institutions have limited power. The UN could propose partition, but couldn't implement it. International law and resolutions matter, but only if nations choose to follow them. Power, not law alone, shapes outcomes. On this November 29th, 78 years after the partition vote, the conflict that it tried to resolve remains one of the world's most intractable. Both Israelis and Palestinians have legitimate claims, legitimate grievances, and legitimate fears. Both have suffered. Both have inflicted suffering. The question isn't who is right in some absolute sense. It's whether these two people can find a way to coexist, to acknowledge each other's humanity and rights, to build a future that honors both their needs. The partition plan failed because it was imposed rather than negotiated, ignored key concerns of one party, and was seen by both sides as either inadequate or completely illegitimate. Any future solution must learn from these failures.